It was a quiet Friday evening in a small family restaurant on the edge of town. The place was warm, filled with the smell of homemade food and the sound of gentle chatter from a few regular customers. Soft lights hung from the ceiling, and an old radio played a calm tune in the background, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Behind the counter, a young woman was moving quickly from one table to another, balancing trays with practiced hands and a tired smile. She had been working since morning, and though her feet ached, she didn't complain. Every shift mattered. Every tip helped her pay for her mother's medicine and the rent that always seemed to be due too soon. She had learned to smile through exhaustion. Some customers were kind, some were rude, but she treated everyone the same, with respect. She never let anyone see how hard life had been lately. The restaurant owner, an older man who had known her since she was a teenager, often told her she had the brightest smile in the whole town. But that evening, her smile would be tested in a way she never expected. Around 7 o'clock, the restaurant door opened, and a tall man in an expensive gray suit stepped inside. His watch gleamed under the dim lights, and the faint smell of cologne followed him in. Everyone looked up for a moment. He was the kind of man who drew attention wherever he went. Confident, sharp, a little too proud. He looked around, clearly unimpressed with the modest place. His shoes clicked against the old wooden floor as he made his way to a corner table. The waitress greeted him politely and handed him a menu. "Good evening, sir. Would you like to start with something to drink?" she asked gently. He didn't even look at her when he answered. "Just water," he said, his tone flat and cold. She nodded, walked back to the counter and filled a glass. When she returned, he was staring at the menu with a look of disbelief. "These prices," he said loudly, "are they for real? You could buy this entire menu for what I pay for lunch in the city." A few people turned to look, but the waitress kept her calm smile. "Yes, sir. We try to keep things affordable for everyone," she said kindly. He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Affordable," he repeated almost to himself. "That's another word for cheap, isn't it?" The comment stung, but she didn't show it. She simply nodded and asked what he'd like to order. He tapped his finger on the table, pretending to think. "Let's see. I'll take the steak, but I want it cooked perfectly. Medium rare, not dry, not bloody. And I want the mashed potatoes made with real butter, not that cheap kind. Oh, and bring me a salad. Not that bag stuff, something fresh, got it?" She jotted everything down and said politely, "Of course, sir. I'll make sure everything's just how you like it." When she turned to leave, he added, "And tell your cook this better be worth my time. I've eaten in places that could buy this restaurant 10 times over." She heard his words, but she didn't reply. Instead, she went to the kitchen, gave the order, and helped prepare other tables. The other staff gave her sympathetic looks. They had all dealt with difficult customers, but this man seemed different. He wasn't just demanding. He was trying to prove something. When his food was ready, she carried the plate carefully to his table. He looked at it for a moment, then frowned. "I said medium rare." "This looks too done," he complained, pushing the plate away. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said softly. "Would you like me to have the kitchen make another one?" He sighed dramatically. "Forget it. Just bring me something else. Maybe you people can get soup, right?" She took the plate back, still calm, though her hands were trembling slightly. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to her like that, but something about this man's tone felt different. It wasn't frustration, it was pride. He was enjoying it. When she returned with his soup, he looked up at her again and said, "Do you ever think about doing something better than this? Or are you happy wasting your life serving food?" The words caught her off guard. "Sir?" she asked quietly. "You're young," he continued. "You should be out there making something of yourself, not running around here picking up other people's plates. Don't you want more than this?" She paused for a moment before answering. "I do want more, sir, but sometimes you have to take care of what's most important first." He smirked. Excuses. Everyone has them. That's why some people stay poor, they accept it." A couple sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen, but it was hard not to hear. The owner, who had been behind the counter, took a step forward, ready to say something, but the waitress shook her head slightly. She didn't want a scene. Instead, she looked the man in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry if the service hasn't met your expectations, sir. I'll do my best to make the rest of your evening pleasant." Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. She turned and walked away, and for a moment, He felt almost disappointed that she hadn't argued. He leaned back in his chair, watching her as she worked. She moved gracefully between tables, smiling at families, chatting with children, and helping an elderly couple find their favorite dessert. There was something about the way she carried herself, calm, kind, unbothered, that made him feel strangely uneasy. When she returned to bring his check, he looked up at her with a half smile. "You've got a good attitude," he said. "Maybe I judged too soon," she smiled politely. "Thank you, sir." He pulled a crisp $100 bill from his wallet and placed it on the table. "Here, maybe you can use this to learn some manners or get a better job." The way he said it turned the gesture into an insult. She looked at the bill, then at him, and said quietly, "Respect doesn't have a price." He blinked, taken aback by her calm tone. "Excuse me?" She didn't repeat herself. She just placed the check neatly on the table, thanked him for visiting, and walked away to help another customer. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a comeback. He looked down at the money and felt an odd wave of discomfort. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something he couldn't quite name. As he left the restaurant, the owner held the door open and said politely, "Thank you for coming, sir." The man nodded but didn't reply. For some reason, the warm air of the small restaurant felt heavier than the luxury of his car waiting outside. He sat behind the wheel, staring at his reflection in the mirror. For a moment, he wondered why that waitress's words bothered him so much. He had dealt with countless people, employees, servers, business partners, and most of them treated him with fear or fake politeness. But this woman hadn't done either. She hadn't bowed down, yet she hadn't been rude. She had simply stood her ground, with dignity. He drove off, but her voice lingered in his mind. Respect doesn't have a price. Over the next few days, her face kept flashing in his thoughts. Not because she was beautiful, but because she was different. Calm, strong. There was something in her that he couldn't quite understand. He mentioned the restaurant to one of his friends, who laughed and said, "Oh, I know that place. They're doing a charity night next week, raising money for kids in the local school. You should come. It'll be good for your public image." The man agreed with a shrug. He didn't care much for charity events, but the thought of seeing that waitress again tugged at his curiosity. Maybe he could prove he wasn't the bad guy she thought he was. Or maybe deep down he wanted to understand why her simple words had unsettled him more than anything else in years. As for the waitress, that night had left her shaken but proud. She didn't let his words break her spirit. After closing, she cleaned the last table, switched off the lights, and sat for a moment in the quiet restaurant. Her hands were sore, her feet ached, but she smiled faintly. She whispered to herself, "People can say what they want. I know who I am." What she didn't know was that this was just the beginning. That same man who had tried to humiliate her would soon return, and this time the tables would turn in a way no one could have imagined. The next week passed quietly at the little restaurant. The days looked the same from the outside, morning light spilling through the windows, the sound of cups clinking, and the smell of coffee filling the air. But something had changed inside the young waitress. She couldn't forget that man in the gray suit, the one who had looked down on her as if she was invisible. She didn't hate him, but his words had stayed in her mind longer than she wanted. They had hurt more than she expected. She had faced rude customers before, but this was different. The way he had said, "You'll never go anywhere," kept replaying in her head like a scratch on a record. It wasn't just his insult. It was the way he said it with such confidence, as if her future had already been decided for her. Still, she didn't let it show. She worked as she always did, smiling, greeting customers, wiping tables, helping children with spilled drinks, and making everyone feel welcome. The owner often told her that people didn't come just for the food. They came because of her kindness. She didn't see it that way. To her, kindness was just what people owed each other. One evening, while she was helping set up for the weekend's charity event, the owner walked up and handed her a small flyer. "We're going to need your help more than usual this weekend," he said with a gentle smile. "A lot of people are coming, even some from out of town. It's for the kids' school fund, so it should be special." She nodded. "Of course, I'll be here." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "I was thinking, maybe you could sing again, like you used to. You remember how you sang at the holiday dinner last year? Everyone loved it." She froze. It had been a long time since she sang in public. Music had been her dream once. She used to sing in local events and small competitions when she was younger, but life had changed when her mother got sick. She had stopped singing, not because she wanted to, but because she had to choose between her dream and her responsibilities. She gave a small, uncertain smile. "It's been a while. I don't know if I can still do it." "You can," the owner said firmly, "and you should. People need to hear you again." She didn't promise anything that night, but later when she was closing up, she stood alone in the quiet dining area. She looked at the small stage in the corner, a place where local singers sometimes performed. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Maybe I could." At the same time, miles away, the man in the gray suit sat in his office, staring at a stack of files he had no interest in reading. The city lights shimmered through the tall windows, but his mind wasn't on business. He kept thinking about that small restaurant and the waitress who had refused his money. He couldn't understand why it bothered him so much. Usually he forgot people as soon as he walked away, but her words, "Respect doesn't have a price," and had hit something deep inside him. Maybe it was because he had spent years earning money, power, and attention, yet none of it made him feel respected in the way she spoke about it. A friend's message popped up on his phone. "Don't forget the charity dinner this weekend." "You promised to come." He had almost forgotten. Normally he wouldn't care about such events, but he had a strange feeling about this one. He typed back, "I'll be there." When Saturday evening arrived, the restaurant was glowing. Fairy lights hung along the walls. Tables were dressed with simple white cloths, and soft music played from a small speaker. The air buzzed with warmth and excitement. The waitress was busy helping guests find seats, carrying trays of food, and making sure everything ran smoothly. She wore a plain blue dress instead of her usual uniform, and for the first time in a long while, she looked less like a worker and more like someone ready to shine. She didn't know he was coming, not yet. When the door opened and he walked in, several people recognized him from local business magazines. The room seemed to quiet down for a moment. He was dressed the same way as before, polished shoes, expensive watch, but something about him looked softer this time. His usual smirk was gone. When the waitress turned and saw him, her heart skipped. She didn't expect to see him again, especially not here. She quickly looked away and focused on her work, pretending not to notice. He watched her from his table. She looked different tonight. The exhaustion was still there, but her eyes seemed brighter, like she carried something strong inside her that he couldn't quite describe. He had come expecting to feel superior again, but instead he felt uneasy, almost guilty. The event began with short speeches from community members. Then came a few small performances. Local kids singing, a guitar player performing softly. Everyone clapped, the room filled with laughter and warmth. Then the owner took the microphone and said, "Before we end the evening, we have one last performance. Some of you might remember her from years ago when she used to sing at our local fairs. She's one of our own, and tonight she's doing something very special for this cause." The waitress froze behind the counter. The owner gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "You can do this." Her hands trembled slightly, but she stepped forward. The crowd began clapping softly as she made her way to the small stage. The man in the gray suit sat up, surprised. She took the microphone, her voice quiet at first. "I wasn't planning to sing tonight," she said with a shy smile. "But sometimes life reminds you that it's never too late to do what you love. This song means a lot to me, and I hope it means something to you too." Then the music started. The first note was soft, almost hesitant, but as she continued, her voice grew stronger. It was pure, emotional, and filled with something real, pain, hope, strength, all mixed into one. The lyrics spoke about holding on, about not letting others decide your worth, and about finding beauty in struggle. People stopped eating. Conversations faded. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Even the children grew quiet. Her voice filled every corner, rising and falling like waves, each note carrying a story. The man in the gray suit sat frozen. It felt as if time had stopped. The woman he had mocked, the one he thought was beneath him, was now commanding the entire room. And he couldn't look away. As the song went on, his mind drifted to his own life. He remembered his early days, sleeping in a shared apartment, working late hours to build his company. Back then he knew struggle. But somewhere along the way, he had lost that part of himself. Money had made him proud, cold, and distant. He had forgotten what humility felt like until now. When the song ended, there was silence for a second. And then the room exploded in applause. People stood, clapping, cheering, and some even wiped tears from their eyes. The waitress bowed her head slightly, overwhelmed. She looked out at the crowd and saw the man in the gray suit. He wasn't clapping at first, he was just staring. Then slowly he joined the applause. For the first time since she met him, his eyes looked human. Not proud, not cold, just real. After the performance, people surrounded her, praising her voice and thanking her for such a beautiful moment. She smiled, blushing slightly, trying to take it all in. It had been years since she'd felt that alive. The man waited until the crowd thinned. Then he stood up and walked toward her. She turned, surprised to see him again. He spoke softly this time, almost awkwardly. "I didn't know you could sing like that." She smiled faintly. "There are a lot of things you don't know about people." He nodded, looking down. "You're right. I was wrong the other night. About everything." She looked at him for a moment, unsure what to say. "It's okay," she said gently. "Sometimes people say things they don't mean." "I meant them then," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But now I wish I hadn't." For a long second, they just stood there, surrounded by the soft hum of people talking in the background. Then she said, "It's never too late to change how we see others." He smiled, almost sadly. "You're wiser than you know." She didn't respond, just gave a small nod before turning to help clean up the stage. That night, as she walked home under the quiet sky, she felt lighter than she had in years. She had faced the man who tried to humiliate her, and without anger or revenge, she had shown him something far more powerful: grace. And somewhere across town, the man sat alone in his luxury apartment, replaying her song in his head. He didn't understand how one voice could undo years of arrogance, but it had. For the first time in a long time, he felt something money couldn't buy: humility. He didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of his change. The same woman he had looked down on was now the reason he would start to look at the world differently. The next morning came with a quiet kind of peace. The sun peeked through the small window of the waitress's room, and for the first time in a long while she woke up smiling. Her performance from the night before still played in her mind like a dream. The way people had stood up to clap, the joy in their eyes, the warmth in their voices, it all felt unreal. She sat at the edge of her bed, brushing her hair and thinking about everything that had happened. It wasn't just about singing. It was about courage. For years she had buried her dream under the weight of responsibility, but last night reminded her that even when life gets heavy, there's still a light inside that doesn't die. It just waits for the right moment to shine again. When she reached the restaurant that morning, the owner greeted her with a proud smile. "You made the whole town talk last night," he said cheerfully. "People are still calling, asking if you'll sing again." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm not used to attention like that. I was just doing it for the charity." "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes doing one good thing opens doors you didn't know existed." She smiled at his words but didn't take them too seriously. Life had taught her not to expect much, just to work hard and take care of the people she loved. But deep down, a small spark had been lit. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Meanwhile, in the city, the man in the gray suit sat in his office, staring out the window. His mind wasn't on work. He had a meeting in 10 minutes, but he couldn't focus on numbers or contracts. The image of that small-town waitress singing her heart out still lingered in his thoughts. He had never seen anything like it. It wasn't just her voice. It was the feeling behind it. It reminded him of the time when he had nothing, when he worked late nights just to keep his small business alive. Back then, he had passion and drive. But over the years, success had turned that drive into pride. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the value of humility. He took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt like he owed someone an apology, not out of guilt, but out of respect. Later that day, he made a call. "Yes," he told his assistant. "Find that restaurant from last weekend, the one that hosted the charity event. I'd like to speak with the owner." The assistant was surprised. "Sir, that's a small place outside the city. Do you want me to schedule a business meeting there?" He paused. "No business, just arrange something." That evening, as the restaurant began to fill with its regular customers, the waitress was busy serving tables when she looked up and froze. The man in the gray suit had just walked in again. The air shifted. A few people recognized him from the charity event. He looked different this time, not arrogant or proud, just quiet and thoughtful. He waited at the entrance until she came over. "Good evening," she said politely. "Would you like a table?" He nodded. "If you don't mind." She led him to a corner seat, the same one he had sat in before. As she placed the menu in front of him, he said softly, "You sang beautifully the other night." She smiled politely. "Thank you. It was for a good cause." He hesitated for a moment before saying, "I owe you an apology for how I acted the first time I came here." She looked at him surprised. Most people never admitted they were wrong. He continued quietly, "I spoke to you in a way I shouldn't have. You didn't deserve that. I thought money made me better than people who work hard, but I was wrong." She didn't know what to say. The same man who had tried to humiliate her was now sitting humbly in front of her. "It's all right," she said gently. "People say things when they're upset. What matters is that you realize it." He nodded slowly. "You said something that night that stuck with me." She tilted her head slightly. "What was that?" "Respect doesn't have a price," he said quietly. "I've thought about it every day since." She smiled faintly. "It's something my mother used to tell me. She always said that no matter how rich or poor you are, how you treat others shows who you really are." He took a deep breath and said, "She sounds like a wise woman." "She is," the waitress said softly. "She's been sick for a while, but she still finds something kind to say every day. She's the reason I keep going." He looked down, his expression thoughtful. For the first time, he realized how small his problems were compared to what some people carried quietly every day. He stayed for dinner, and unlike before, he didn't make a single complaint. He thanked her when she brought his food and complimented the cook. When he left, he didn't leave money on the table to prove a point. Just a simple, "Good night and thank you." The waitress watched him go, wondering if she'd ever see him again. A few days later, a delivery truck arrived outside the restaurant. The driver handed the owner a large envelope addressed to the business. Inside was a donation letter. The man in the gray suit had contributed a large amount to the children's charity the restaurant supported. There was also a small note that said, "In honor of people who never stop trying." When the waitress heard about it, she smiled. "Maybe he's not who I thought he was." But that wasn't the end of it. One afternoon, she came to work to find a small group of people setting up video cameras inside the restaurant. The owner explained that a local news channel was doing a short feature about the charity event and wanted to include her song. She was nervous, but the owner encouraged her. "Just be yourself. You've already touched hearts. Now let more people hear your story." The segment aired a week later. Her story spread beyond the town. People admired her strength and her voice. The man in the gray suit watched the interview from his office, feeling a mix of pride and regret. He decided to visit one last time. When he arrived, she was just finishing her shift. He waited until the rush was over before approaching her. "You're becoming famous," he said with a small smile. She laughed softly. "I'm just a waitress who sings sometimes." "Maybe so," he said, "but you've changed more than you know. You made me look at my life differently." She looked at him curiously. "How so?" He leaned against the counter. "I used to think success was about having more money, more power, more control. But after seeing you that night, I realized I've been chasing the wrong things. You had nothing to prove, yet everyone in that room respected you. You didn't demand it. You earned it just by being kind and honest." She was quiet for a moment. "I think real success is being able to sleep at night knowing you didn't hurt anyone on your way up." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the lesson I needed." They talked for a while about life, about dreams, about how people change. Before leaving, he said, "If you ever decide to sing again, really sing professionally, I'd like to help. Not out of pity, out of belief." She thought about it. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I'm not sure if I'm ready." "I still have responsibilities," he nodded. "Take your time. Just promise me one thing. Don't let fear stop you from doing what you love." She smiled. "I'll try." After he left, she stood for a long moment near the door, thinking about everything that had happened. Life had a strange way of connecting people. A few weeks ago, he had been just another customer trying to make her feel small. Now, he had become someone who reminded her of her own strength. In the weeks that followed, she began to sing again. Small performances at the restaurant during weekends, local fairs, and sometimes even at charity events. People loved her not just for her voice, but for her story. And somewhere across town, the man in the gray suit often watched from afar, proud, but quiet. He didn't want credit for anything. He just wanted to support in silence as someone who had been humbled by life's most unexpected teacher. One evening, after her last song of the night, she stepped outside to catch her breath. The stars were bright above and the cool wind brushed her face. She thought about how much had changed, not just for her, but for him too. Sometimes life doesn't need grand moments or big gestures to change people. Sometimes it's just a single act of grace, a smile, a kind word, or a song sung from the heart that can turn someone's whole world around. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew that moment in the small restaurant had changed them forever. The sound of applause still echoed through the room long after her final note faded. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, and calling her name. The entire restaurant, once filled with chatter and movement, was now full of warmth and admiration. The young waitress stood on stage, her cheeks flushed and her eyes shining with tears she could no longer hold back. She smiled shyly and bowed, overwhelmed by the love around her. Among the people clapping was the same man who had once mocked her. But this time his expression was completely different. The arrogance that once lived in his eyes was gone. He looked almost small sitting there, his usually perfect posture bent slightly forward, his hands still moving without rhythm. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. As she walked off the small stage, the restaurant owner rushed to hug her. "You did it," he whispered proudly. "I always knew you had something special in you." She smiled through her tears. "Thank you for believing in me," she said softly. People surrounded her, complimenting her voice, her courage, her kindness. A few even recorded her performance, excited to share it online. She was radiant, glowing in a way that had nothing to do with fame but everything to do with self-respect. Meanwhile, the man stayed seated, his thoughts racing. He remembered that day a week ago, how he had spoken to her as if she was beneath him, how he had thrown money at her just to feed his pride. He could still see the calm look in her eyes when she said, "Respect doesn't have a price." Back then, he thought she was just another ordinary worker with no ambition. But tonight, he realized she was more successful than he had ever been, not because of money, but because of heart. He stood up slowly and walked toward her. For the first time, he didn't feel like the most important person in the room. He waited until the crowd around her thinned out, then gently tapped her shoulder. She turned, her expression still glowing with joy, though she looked a little surprised to see him. "I didn't know you could sing like that," he said, his tone softer than ever before. She smiled politely. "I used to sing when I was younger. Life got busy and I had to stop for a while." He nodded awkwardly. "You were incredible." "I mean it, thank you," she said simply. There was no bitterness in her voice, no sign of revenge or pride. Just peace. For a few seconds, silence hung between them. The man shifted uncomfortably as if the weight of his guilt pressed harder the longer he looked at her. He finally spoke again. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I was rude. No, I was cruel that day. I spoke without thinking." Her expression softened. "It's all right," she said. "Sometimes people say things when they're unhappy inside." Her words hit him like a mirror reflecting his own life. Unhappy inside, yes, that was him. He had spent years chasing success, money, and status, but deep down, he couldn't remember the last time he truly felt happy. He had a mansion full of furniture but no warmth, an expensive car but no destination that made him feel alive. And here she was, someone who had little but seemed to have everything he didn't. He looked around the restaurant again. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the joy, it all felt real, something money couldn't buy. "I'd like to help you," he said finally. "Maybe I can fund your music or help your family. Whatever you need, just say it." She shook her head gently. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not looking for help. I'm just happy doing what I love." He blinked, taken aback by her response. Most people he met were eager to take whatever he offered. But she didn't even think twice. She wasn't being proud, she was simply content. "You're different," he said quietly. She smiled. "Not really. I just learned that happiness doesn't come from what you have. It comes from how you see yourself." Her words sank deep into him. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stood there realizing that for all his wealth, he'd spent years never really seeing people, only judging them. He had mistaken worth for appearance, success for kindness, and confidence for arrogance. The restaurant owner came over then, smiling. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said politely to the man. "It means a lot to have your support for the charity." The man nodded slowly. "I should be thanking you. This place. It's something special." As he left that night, he turned back one last time. She was laughing with the staff, wiping tables even after performing, helping everyone pack up. He smiled faintly. For the first time, he understood that dignity had nothing to do with status. It was about the way she carried herself. Humble, kind, unshaken. That night, as he drove home, the city lights seemed dimmer than usual. He kept hearing her voice in his head. Not her singing, but her words. Respect doesn't have a price. He thought about how many people he might have hurt without realizing it, just because he believed his money made him more important. When he got home, the silence of his big house felt heavier than ever. He poured himself a drink but didn't take a sip. Instead, he sat by the window staring out at the night sky. He thought about his younger self, the boy who once worked small jobs just to survive, the one who promised himself he'd never be poor again. Somewhere along the way, that boy had turned into a man who looked down on others. He stayed up late that night thinking, and for the first time in years, he felt something change inside him, something real. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was clarity. Over the next few days, he found himself coming back to the restaurant quietly, without the fancy car or expensive suit. Sometimes he ordered just a cup of coffee, sometimes a simple meal. The waitress always greeted him with the same polite smile as she did with everyone else. They didn't talk much, but there was no tension between them anymore. It was peaceful. He began noticing small things, and how she always helped the older customers with their coats, how she checked on the cooks after closing, how she encouraged the young waiter who often made mistakes. She didn't complain or seek attention. She just did what needed to be done with kindness. One evening, the owner joined him at the counter and said, "She's been through a lot, you know. Her mother's been sick for years. She could have left this town, but she stayed to take care of her." The man nodded slowly. "She's stronger than most people I know," he said quietly. The owner smiled. "She doesn't see herself that way. She just does what's right." He realized that was exactly what made her special. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She just lived her truth. Later that night, he went home and looked at his reflection in the mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, not because of age, but because of what he saw in his own eyes. They weren't empty anymore. There was something there now. Humility, maybe even gratitude. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel the event next week," he said, "and start looking for local charities that help single mothers or struggling families." His assistant sounded surprised. "All of them?" "Yes," he said firmly. "I want to do something real this time." When he hung up, he felt lighter. For once, he didn't feel like he was spending money to impress anyone. He just wanted to help, quietly, without being seen. A week later, he returned to the restaurant again. She was there, serving tables as usual. When she saw him, she smiled warmly. "You're back again," she said. He smiled. "I guess your coffee tastes better than anywhere else," she laughed. "It's just regular coffee." "Maybe," he said, "but it feels different here." He handed her a small envelope before leaving. "This is for the charity," he said. "Nothing personal, just something I want to contribute." She thanked him and he walked out. She didn't know that inside the envelope was a check big enough to keep the restaurant's charity program running for months. He didn't want recognition, he just wanted to give back. As he stepped into his car, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. That night, for the first time in a long while, he slept easily. He didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was clear. The arrogant man who once looked down on others was gone. In his place was someone learning to see people as they truly were. And the waitress, without even trying, had reminded him that true wealth isn't in the money we own, but in the kindness we share. Months passed since that unforgettable night when the man saw the waitress sing and realized how wrong he had been. The restaurant had grown busier than ever. People came not only for the food but for the warmth that filled the place. Some came hoping to catch another glimpse of the young woman who had touched so many hearts with her voice. But she hadn't performed again since that evening. She wanted that night to remain special, a moment that spoke for itself. She spent most of her time working, saving money and taking care of her mother, who was slowly recovering. She still smiled at every customer, still helped everyone around her, but there was a calm new strength in her presence now. The man visited often, always quietly. He no longer arrived in his expensive car or wearing designer suits. Sometimes he came in simple clothes, blending in with the other customers. He never talked much about his past or his wealth. To most people, he looked like just another regular visitor. But the waitress knew who he was. She had seen the change in him, not just in words, but in actions. He often donated to local families in need, paid for children's school supplies, and once helped an old woman who couldn't afford her rent, all without attaching his name to it. The restaurant owner often said, "People change when they start seeing others instead of themselves." One quiet afternoon, when the lunch rush had ended, the waitress was wiping tables when she noticed the man sitting by the window, staring outside with a peaceful look on his face. She walked over and asked, "Would you like some tea?" He smiled. "That would be nice." She brought him a cup and sat down across from him for a moment, something she rarely did before. The air between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was calm, full of understanding that didn't need many words. "You come here often these days," she said with a soft laugh. He nodded. "This place feels different. It reminds me of what I used to forget." She tilted her head curiously. "What's that?" He looked down at his cup and said quietly, "That people matter more than things. That respect and kindness are worth more than money." She smiled. "You already knew that. Maybe you just needed a reminder." He laughed lightly. "You might be right." A moment of silence followed, then he looked at her again. "You know that night you sang? It changed something in me. I can't explain it fully, but it made me want to live differently. Not just to earn or to win, but to do something that means something." Her eyes softened. "That's the best kind of change." He hesitated for a second, then said, "I started a new foundation. It helps small-town artists, singers, painters, writers, anyone who has talent but no support. I want people like you to have a chance to dream without giving up everything." Her mouth fell slightly open in surprise. That's wonderful," he smiled modestly. "It's a small start, but it's something real." She could see the sincerity in his eyes. This wasn't about redemption or reputation. He truly wanted to give back. "That's more than real," she said gently. "That's powerful. You're giving hope to people who need it." He shrugged slightly. "You gave it to me first." She blinked, touched by his words. "I didn't do much," she said quietly. "Yes, you did," he replied. "You showed me that dignity doesn't come from what we own, but how we live." She didn't know what to say after that, so she just smiled. There was no need for more words. The moment spoke for itself. In the following weeks, the foundation started gaining attention. Local newspapers wrote about it, calling it a heartfelt project by a once reclusive businessman. He never talked about his past mistakes or mentioned the waitress, but everyone who knew the story understood where the change began. One evening, a small concert was held to raise funds for the foundation. Artists from nearby towns came to perform. The restaurant owner insisted that the waitress should sing again. She hesitated at first, saying she didn't want to be in the spotlight, but everyone encouraged her. Finally, she agreed. When the night came, the place was full. The lights were soft, the air filled with anticipation. The man sat quietly in the front row, not as a guest of honor, but as a supporter like everyone else. When she stepped up to the microphone, there was a quiet hush. She took a deep breath, her eyes finding him in the crowd. For a moment, she remembered the first time he walked into the restaurant, how proud and dismissive he had been, and how far they both had come since then. Then she began to sing. Her voice was even more beautiful than before, steady, warm, and full of emotion. The song was about forgiveness, strength, and second chances. It spoke of how people can lose themselves but still find their way back if they choose to see the light again. Every word came from her heart, and every note touched the audience deeply.